Welcome. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. I am Ross Cattell, the president of Bryant University. I'm very pleased to be here today to introduce our second talk in the Center for Health and Behavioral Sciences seminar series, which is co-sponsored by the Honors Program. This series serves to bring together speakers from many different sectors of health and healthcare to share their expertise with the Bryant community and beyond. The Honors Program has long played an integral part in the Bryant educational experience and community. It does this by fostering the engagement of students and faculty in meaningful and comprehensive analysis of topics across a wide range of disciplines. This is done in part by creating an environment that sparks students' curiosity and the desire to learn beyond the borders of their individual disciplines. Likewise, the newly founded Center for Health and Behavioral Sciences serves as a central hub to facilitate more of this type of discussion, but more specifically, the integration of health, behavioral health, and healthcare into interdisciplinary academic offerings and provides research opportunities for students to work with faculty members on projects that solve real-world problems in a collaborative and innovative way. It is through events like this speaker series that we strive to educate and inspire our great community to find a passion for learning. The current pandemic has served to highlight this need for lifelong learning as the events of these trying times continuously unfold in real time, and we are forced to make decisions in uncertain times. I will now turn it over to Professor Hoeknes to introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, President Cattell. It is my pleasure as Director of the Center for Health and Behavioral Sciences, which was founded earlier this year in large part as a result of a generous donation from the Fred M. Roundy Foundation, to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michael Osterholm. Michael Osterholm is hailed by CNN as the infectious disease expert who has been warning us for a decade and a half that the world will face a pandemic. He quickly became an expert on public health impact and on the impact of COVID-19. Dr. Osterholm currently serves as Regents Professor, McKnight Presidential Endowed Chair in Public Health, the Director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Division of Environmental Health Sciences, School of Public Health, a Professor in the Technological Leadership Institute, College of Sciences and Engineering, and an Adjunct Professor in the Medical School, all at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Osterholm also played a pivotal role in Biden's transition for the COVID-19 task force. Dr. Osterholm actually just informed me that he was, as an undergrad, both a biology and a political science major. So proving that the Bryant educational experience and combining interdisciplinary majors is really important. Is here to talk us a little bit about life after the pandemic. And while I think most of us, as we sort of reflect on a year of quite a challenging time facing this pandemic, we'd all probably love to have all of the answers for what life after the pandemic will hold. But he's going to talk a little bit about sort of what life may be expected given some certain scenarios and what's going on with the virus. So I turn it over to Dr. Osterholm. Just as a reminder, I will be monitoring the chat. So you can put some questions in the chat, and we've left plenty of time at the end to be able to answer questions and foster some conversation. So please feel free to put those questions in the chat, and I'll forward them off to Dr. Osterholm at the end of his talk. So go ahead, Dr. Osterholm.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Hoeknes and President Cattell, for having me. And I do feel right at home here in the Bryant University community as someone who has long espoused the need for multiple approaches to education, including the sciences and arts brought together. And as you noted, I actually was in my undergraduate days both a biology and political science major, and there are many, many days I can't tell you for certain which of the two majors played more of an important role on that given day of what I needed to do. So I can't speak any more strongly in support of what you've done here, and particularly for the Center for Health and Behavioral Studies, the issue around this pandemic bring those two together in such an incredibly important way. So thank you very much for having me. I have one disclosure I need to make before we get started here so people can put my words into context. I actually probably know less about this virus right now than I did 6 months ago. So I'll tell you what I know, what I don't know, and why I know and what I don't know, and leave you to understand or decide what you can then take away from my comments. I think that anyone who doesn't admit that today doesn't really understand the complexity of some of the challenges we're facing. And so I hope that is in of itself helpful. The other thing that I want to share with you up front is that anytime you have a presentation like this, you end up talking about numbers, you talk about cases and deaths and all these kinds of things where we might go. And I think in an institution like this, you have such a much more what I would call rounded and empathetic understanding of that. Just to give you an idea, if today, right now, we actually were to say the name of every person who has died of COVID-19 during the duration of this pandemic, just in the United States, and we did it every 3 seconds. Kirsten Hoken, Michael Ostrom. If we did it like that, every 3 seconds, it would take us right now over 18 and a half days nonstop to say every name. That should give people a sense of what this virus has done and where it's at. So, but where are we going? What's happening? A pandemic is a worldwide epidemic. We actually understood that at our center where I lead them in December of 2019. We published our first article on what's happening in Wuhan on December 30th of 2019. Followed it very closely and were able to come to the conclusion that by January 20th of 2020, over a year ago, that this was going to cause this worldwide epidemic, i.e. pandemic. And it was at that point where, in fact, we made a public statement and said that this was going to be the cause of the next pandemic. Historically, humans have thought of pandemics of respiratory viruses as being that of influenza. We've had 11 such pandemics in the last 250 years, where typically influenza virus would change, take on new characteristics, transmitted widely, cause serious disease. Of those 11 pandemics we've had in the last 250 years, 3 started in our winter, 3 started in our spring, 2 in our summer, and 3 in our fall. In each case, there'd be a first big wave that would occur without regard to any human intervention, would in a sense go away. And then we would see a second and even a third wave that would occur weeks to months later, again, usually without any regard to what humans did. When this coronavirus came up, we didn't know what it would do. We didn't understand what it might look like because we'd never seen one before. Coronaviruses, as we've known them in the past in terms of serious illness, have really revolved around the SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, the outbreak that occurred in 2003 around the world, but primarily in Asia. And then the 2012 MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome outbreak in the Arabian Peninsula. And in both cases, they were quickly brought under control because people understood that you weren't really that infectious till the 5th or 6th day of your illness. This one was very different. People were infectious long before they got sick, if they got sick at all, and they could be highly infectious. That made it very difficult to try to control this outbreak, and that's why we in January of 2020 actually said this is going to be causing a pandemic because we've already seen worldwide spread of the virus. So we spend the rest of the year here going back and forth. What can we do to mitigate or reduce the likelihood that this is going to be a problem? This surely has been a very, very serious challenge to every aspect of our lives. And no one needs to look further than higher ed and the challenges it's presented there, but also even in our own families, our friends, our colleagues, our business world, government. It's all been a challenge there. But the one thing that has been a real shining light in all of this has been the new vaccines, really created in absolute, almost magical time to get from a new virus to a vaccine that was approved by regulatory authorities in 11 months is simply just remarkable. So we now have a vaccine that we're rolling out. The vaccine, however, is one that is in relatively short supply, just not adequate manufacturing capacity. Right now in the United States, we're rolling out about 2.7 million doses a day, but for almost all the people getting vaccinated are getting one of the 2-dose vaccines, which means really only about half of that 2.7 or 1.35 million people a day are being vaccinated. We still have many people who are at risk for this disease in terms of serious illness that have not yet been vaccinated. And this is going to be a challenge for us over the course of the days ahead. Why do I say that? Well, if you have followed this pandemic, you know that in April of 2020, we saw a flare of cases, a surge of cases, particularly in the New York City metropolitan area. We got to 32,000 cases a day. Case numbers came down after that surge. By Memorial Day, we were at 22,000 cases, but then again in July, we saw another big surge, primarily in the southern Sunbelt states, from California to Georgia. We got to 72,000 cases a day. Couldn't imagine it get any worse. Case numbers came down again as we took steps to try to reduce transmission. By Labor Day, we were now at about 26,000 cases a day and almost feeling like, oh, we're out of the woods. And then we saw in November, late October, November, a peak of 200,000 cases a day, coming down in December to 140,000 cases a day. And then lo and behold, in January in this country, we actually hit over 300,000 cases a day. Now, each time that we did those new highs and lows, it was as if we were shifting our baseline. We got to the point where we said, well, only 40,000 or only 50,000 cases a day, that's not so bad. When in fact, had that been just earlier in April or July, that would have been a house on fire moment. So it's been interesting how we've, in a sense, adjusted our expectations to what might happen. Now we're at about 55,000 cases a day and the vaccines are coming. However, we have a challenge. And I just point this out because we're going to talk primarily about the post-pandemic era, but you need to understand some of the challenges we have to get to that point. First and immediate. Right now, the world saw a major increase in cases on a worldwide basis. We were seeing almost 5 million new cases a week, determined by the WHO, through early January. Then the case numbers dropped down precipitously, just like they did here in this country, and such that by the second week of February, we were down to about 2,700,000 cases, almost half of what it was before. People were feeling pretty good. Well, unfortunately, we're going back up. We're now at about 3.9 million new cases a day worldwide, given all the limitations of reporting. But the problem is that this virus is coming back in a big way. As we speak, in the Americas alone, just as a context issue, even though we're feeling pretty good about where we're at, in the Americas right now, 1/3 of all the deaths this week are due to COVID-19. That exceeds by far all the other causes of death that we know. If you look at other areas in Europe where we're now seeing resurgence of a new variant, which I'll talk about in a moment, we're seeing the same thing. So we're not done with this pandemic at all. And even here in the United States, what's going to be the changing feature? Something that happened in November. For the two of you on this webinar today that are old enough to remember 60s music, there's the old singing group called The Fifth Dimension. And they had a song that was about the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Well, ever since October, I have been singing in my head, morning, noon, and night, this is the dawning of the age of the variants. And what we're seeing happen here is that this virus mutates like all other viruses, bacteria, and parasites do. But we thought that this was an orderly type of mutation pattern, where we were actually aging the virus by picking up 1 or 2 new mutations a month, could tell you how kind of old it was from where it originated. And then all of a sudden, something changed in October and November. We saw major mutational changes occur, and we came up with a thing called variants that are mutated viruses that have different characteristics. Most variants do not harm us any more, any less than any other ones. But there are some variants called variants of concern. And these variants of concern right now are a challenge because they fall into basically 3 rough buckets. The first bucket is they're more infectious, much more transmissible, 50 to 70% more. The second bucket is they cause more severe disease, even 50% more severe disease across all the ages. And the third bucket, which is the most alarming, is that in fact they can actually evade the immune protection of vaccines or of natural disease and the immunity you get from that. Well, when these variants emerged in October, November, one of them emerged in the United Kingdom, one we call B117, which fit into the two first buckets, much more infectious and much more likely to cause severe disease. I'll come back to that in a moment. The other variants that we were concerned about, P1, a variant that was first found in Brazil, actually has the ability to evade immune protection from either the vaccine or clinical illness. And this is one that is of grave concern to us today. While it doesn't completely eliminate the protection of previous infection or vaccines, it surely can seriously compromise it. And so where are we at relative to these variants right now? In the United States, we are now seeing very, very rapid spread of this B117 variant. And many of the areas in the country now are well over 50% of all the virus isolates are that variant. And we're now just beginning to see the turn in cases. Just in the last 2 weeks, we've seen us go from most states showing drops to now states either leveling off or substantially increasing. Just to give you an example, two areas that we're seeing major activity increasing right now. One of them is, for example, in the upper Midwest. And if we look at what's happened here in the last 7 days, even though we have anywhere from 15.5 to 18.7% of the population vaccinated, in Michigan, we've had a 47% increase in the last 7 days, Minnesota 22%, South Dakota 26%, North Dakota 12%, and Wisconsin 6%. In the East Coast area, close to you, if we look there, also same relatively high levels of vaccination given where we're at in terms of timing. And Connecticut's just witnessed a 15% increase in the last 7 days, New York 13%, New Jersey 6%, Massachusetts 12%, and Maryland 11%. And what we're now beginning to see is what is likely to be this next surge or wave of cases. And I know anyone who is in higher ed today knows about a thing called spring break. I congratulate your university in having very thoughtfully considered the implications of spring break, because I think right now one of the hottest places in the country for these new variants, this B117, is Florida. And we're very concerned what's going to happen over the next month as students from that experience of spring break come back to our different states. So in the short term, although the vaccines work against this variant, we are going to see much more infections. We're going to see much more transmission. Case numbers are going to climb again. And at this point, only about 50 to 55% of the population may be still vulnerable to the virus. That's a lot of people, though. So think about that. All the pain, suffering, death we've experienced over the last year, all the vaccine that's gone on still means that 50 to 55% of the people are still susceptible. So we're going to see that. But that, I think, we'll get over. We will get through that. And I believe by summer, we'll have an adequate amount of vaccine for every adult in this country. We will also see a situation where by early fall, we'll have approval for vaccines for our kids down to 10 years of age. And I think easily by Christmas time, we'll actually have vaccines approved for infants 6 months of age and older. So we could put that kind of on the shelf and say it still may cause us some challenges into the summer, but we can handle this one. But the next one is the real challenge, the one on the post-pandemic world stage. What is it going to look like? Well, think about this. First of all, these variants, the things I talked about, occur when the virus is transmitted from person to person and new infections occur. That is where we see the environmental pressure, the evolutionary pressure for the virus to adapt and actually be able to beat the presence of antibody that we might get from natural infection in these vaccines. One of the key ones is P1, the one that I mentioned was found in Brazil. Let me paint this story for you, what's happened and is happening right now. In an area of far northwestern Brazil, Manaus, Brazil, a city of 2.5 million people at the headwaters of the Amazon River, landlocked in the sense that you can only get into it by boat or by airplane. Last May, June, and July, they had a tremendous house on fire outbreak in that city of COVID-19. It's estimated that over 75% of the city were infected. they had mass burial graves every day just to handle the thousands and thousands of people who died. At that point, they actually had a situation where they kept running out of oxygen so frequently that you could actually plot out on the days the oxygen ran out, because the deaths would increase by hundreds and hundreds of people. They finally that virus transmitted so widely that so many people appeared to be immune that they thought they were over with it. And in fact, this past summer published papers indicating they'd hit this concept of called herd immunity, where enough people are immune because of previous infection. It'd be like rods in a virus reaction. If everybody around me is already protected and I get it, I don't really have the ability to transmit much. That's what, in fact, the assumption was. And then along comes this new viral variant P1. It has a mutation that actually does compromise the protection of the immunity that we get from natural disease or vaccine. Manaus lit on fire again late November, December, and January. This time, even more people became severely ill and died. Many, many of these were people who had previously been infected. Even some had participated in a vaccine study where we saw the vaccines work very, very poorly. Some protection clearly reduced the serious illness to some degree, but nonetheless defeated the vaccine far too often. Now, as I speak to you today, virtually throughout the entire country of Brazil, this virus has taken hold. Over a third of all the intensive care units in the country are overwhelmed, not able to take any more patients because of this. The deaths are rising every day. And at this point, the vaccine issue is a challenge, because how much does it really work against this virus? The same thing was seen in South Africa. There was a variant there called B1351 that emerged there, also able to defeat the vaccine and natural immunity. Again, some limited protection clearly was afforded by them, but in fact, it was still a real challenge. The reason I bring all this up to you is because had this been before October, November, and I'd given this lecture, I would have charted out a course saying, we're going to get vaccines, they're coming, everything's going to be normal within 5 to 6 months once we get enough vaccine. Hold on. Who wants to be the person to die from COVID-19 3 days before they're supposed to get their vaccine? No, nobody. Now we have to ask ourselves, what does our future look like? Think of it this way. Originally, when we first plotted out the vaccine strategy, of course, everyone said, well, we have to take care of the low and middle income countries. This is a humanitarian issue. And so a group was formed called COVAX through the World Health Organization in conjunction with a number of foundations and government entities to work to get vaccine to the low and middle income countries. But for this next year, their plans were no more than 20% of those individuals would be able to get vaccine, just because we didn't have enough manufacturing capacity or the ability to deliver the vaccine. Think about where the variants come from, natural infection. Over the course of the next several years, we're not going to see this virus slow down necessarily in low and middle income countries. And during that time, this virus is going to continue to spit out these variants that challenge the very integrity of the vaccines that we use here in the United States or in Europe or in other countries like that. So suddenly we've gone from a humanitarian issue by itself, which is surely more than enough reason to want to get vaccines to the low and middle income countries. But now we're also talking about what are we going to do to get everyone vaccinated in the world and keep them vaccinated so that in fact, we don't see these variants arise, which could threaten the very integrity of our vaccines. Now, at the same time, work is being done to look at new and better vaccines that might be more protective against these variants. But I wish I could tell you today that next fall, you're going to get back to life as normal. It's very possible you are not. It's very likely that this summer, if we don't see these new variants that I talked about that can evade immune protection, with vaccines, we can start to experience a kind of new normal. That is going to get better. But the scenario that I have for you like that is all dependent on will these other variants continue to spread? Will we see them have worldwide impact? And just because you've been vaccinated or previously infected doesn't mean you're protected. This is a very, very uneasy place to be. It's very difficult. all of us want closure. We are all mentally and physically exhausted with this pandemic. We have known far too many of our friends and colleagues who have died, our family members. So it's not with any great joy I bring this message to you today, say, hold on until we understand what we can do to stop the transmission of this virus in low and middle income countries, until we can understand how to defeat these variants that might evade immune protection. We might still be looking at this very same picture next year at this time, which would for most people be unbelievable. You wouldn't think you could do it. I knew even back in January of 2020, when I understood the implications of this pandemic, last March 10th, a year ago, I said on the Joe Rogan podcast, I thought that this virus could kill up to 480,000 people in the United States. And at that time, I was seen as a wingnut, a scaremonger. Today, we're at 540,000 deaths, and the number is still counting. Now I sit here and tell you we're not done yet. We've got a ways to go. So at this point, we can hope vaccines, as we now have them, will help us get through the B117. The one exception I think that we have to understand that we're doing right now, the rest of the world is not, we're opening up. We're making it seem as if this virus never existed. Right now, much of Europe is in lockdowns. Germany yesterday just announced a new extensive lockdown. We're seeing countries around Europe where they're doing the same because they can't control it with what limited vaccine they have. I don't see us having any appetite for that, but that means we're going to see a lot more transmission. The one thing I'd also point out is that for this age population, one of the important things is while it has been an age of students, adult students, where we see less severe illness, we are going to see more. B117 is causing more severe illness across all age groups. So it still is going to be much less than we'd expect to see in someone 65 years of age and older, but it's going to occur. But the other thing that's starting to happen, which is of real concern to us, is what we call long haulers or long COVID. This is a situation we're seeing happen much, much more frequently in young, previously healthy adults, where their first experience with this virus is kind of mild. They say, this isn't so bad. And then 2, 3, and 4 weeks out, they continue to just basically go downhill. More lethargy, they're tired, they don't have energy. Some will experience what they call brain fog. Others will find it very difficult to breathe. And such that by the time you get out to 6 or 8 weeks after that initial infection, when you didn't think it was all that bad, you may be totally disabled at home. I know far too many individuals like this where they're sitting at home on oxygen. If you look at their chest pictures or their heart, there's ongoing damage there. We don't understand exactly why. It doesn't appear to be due to the virus, but rather to your immune response. But we don't want young adults to get infected with this virus. It's not even just about will you get in an intensive care unit and potentially lose your life that way. Very real. But it's also about this long haulers or long COVID disease that is important. So hold on. Please don't give up. When it's your turn to get vaccine. All of you should be eligible for it at some point in the near future. By age, it'll go down to 16 and 18 years of age. And at this point, just stay tuned. I wish I had more definitive information for you. I wish I could say to you in the post-pandemic world, this is what it'll be like. You'll never wear a mask again. You'll be able to go back in crowded theaters. You can do whatever you want. And at this point, we're just not sure when we could tell you that at all. So I'll leave it with that, Professor, and turn it back over to you. And I'd be happy to take any questions or comments that you have. So thank you.
Great. So I just want to remind everyone that you can put your questions into the Q&A portion of your screen and not the chat function. So I have a bunch of questions sort of all over the place. So one of them has to do a little bit with the variants that you were talking about. And so with the variants, would this lead to the need for vaccines indefinitely, somewhat kind of like the flu vaccine?
At this point, I can't imagine a world without ongoing vaccines for COVID. What I can tell you is that this is likely not going to be the only coronavirus that's going to emerge like this. So what we need to work on, and we are working on right now, are looking at second and third generation vaccines, ones that might be given periodically, that will cover a range of the different coronaviruses that are what we call multivalent vaccines, where it affects both the antibody production, the B cells, the T cells, the combination thereof. And so that very well would be the case. Again, it's always going to come back also to global supply, and we need to vaccinate the world because the strains, the variants we most worry about could very easily spin out of uncontrolled outbreaks in the lower income countries. And so it's not only a vaccine that we will probably be taking, well into the future, but it's also one that we have to provide to the world. Let me make one last point. When we talk about eradicating a disease, which of course everyone wants to do, that means we get it off the face of the earth, like smallpox. One of the huge challenges we have in trying to eradicate a disease, if it has an animal reservoir, meaning that animals can get infected too, then it makes it almost impossible to vaccinate humans and expect that you're not going to see this virus return. Well, we've had a whole series of experiences since this summer with dogs and cats, mink, ferrets, the great apes, all laundry list of animals that have now become infected with this virus. And in fact, in England, they've reported this past week that during the big surge of cases they had there in late December into January, they had a major increase in the number of dogs reporting with myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart. And they were able to demonstrate in a number of these that they were in fact infected with B117, a variant, and suggesting that the owner in each case was the source for their pet. The owner got sick first and then transmitted to the pet. So when you also add animals in, that means it's going to be around for some time, and likely all the more reason why we're going to need a lifetime of vaccines.
So I'm trying to put together a few different questions, but there's some questions about what point do you think we'll have enough information on the current vaccines to be able to maybe alleviate some of the concerns regarding either getting a vaccine or, going off of that point in terms of reaching that herd immunity?
This is a huge, huge issue. And let me take a step back and say that you can take my comments in this context. I've served roles in the last 5 presidential administrations. The previous administration, I served for 18 months as a science envoy for the State Department, traveled around the world on pandemic preparedness, ironically, educating countries about that. I have, as state epidemiologist here in Minnesota, served for 2 Republican governors, 2 Democratic governors, 1 independent governor. No one can really tell you my partisan politics. So please take my comments that I'm just another soldier in the public health army to say, what I think is going on and what's not going on. When we look at the vaccine development, you have to acknowledge that this program developed here in the United States called Operation Warp Speed was a tremendous, tremendous success in bringing a vaccine for approval through emergency use authorization in such a short time. But the problem was that the program really worked on that part of the vaccination process. And don't forget, a vaccine is nothing until it becomes a vaccination. And so what Operation Warp Speed didn't do is, first of all, give us a name that people could trust. When people hear that, they know the military is involved. There's rumors that there was a political thumb on the scale to get it approved before the election, etc., all giving the public real concerns about the safety and the effectiveness of these vaccines. Then on top of it, we now have what we call a messenger RNA platform, a type of vaccine where we are injecting this material into you where your own body will produce, in a sense, the vaccine. And people say, well, this is, putting a chip inside of me. It's dangerous. I'm not going to do it. And in fact, these messenger RNA vaccines have been used for the past 30 years in cancer work. We have lots of information about their safety, how they work, what they can do. But the public didn't hear that. And then finally, when you put this all together with the issue of just their safety, we now see the military involved in distributing the vaccine, which for a lot of people is a real challenge in terms of what does this mean? How do I? Well, we never, ever did a good job at all of sharing with the public, what does this all mean? How safe are these vaccines? They're very safe. What do they do to protect us? How do they protect us? Do they take over my genes? Will they affect my pregnancy? Will they make me sterile? The things are all right now on the disinformation line of the internet. And so one of the challenges we have today is how do we redo that? How do we get a redo where we actually spend the time helping to educate people about what these vaccines are and what they're not and how they can save lives? It's notable that this past week, the Kaiser Health Foundation just published a very extensive survey they did where 50% of healthcare workers in this country have not yet taken the vaccine out of fear of safety issues. None justified or any basis, but they just felt like they didn't have enough information. 2 weeks ago, we learned that 1/3 of all military service persons, men and women, have refused to take the vaccine in our military. 1/3. I go down the list of all the people right now that are hurting in terms of getting them vaccinated to help protect themselves and then also help protect the population. If we don't see most of the people vaccinated, this virus will continue to circulate for days, weeks, and months ahead. And that's going to be a challenge. So in short, we need to do a much better job. This administration is committing to that. There's going to be some major efforts coming out very shortly, within days, that will help educate the public, will help the public understand the difference. If you're a young Black man in Minneapolis, that may be very different than if you're a pregnant white female in a healthcare setting versus if you're a person working in long-term care and you have never accessed the American healthcare system before yourself as a recent arrival from Africa. We've seen all of these different combinations where it's made it very, very hard to help people understand just how good these vaccines are and what they can do. And so I just want to reinforce that everything you just said is right on the mark, and we've got to do a much, much better job.
So somewhat along the same lines, you mentioned, the success, in your opinion, of Operation Warp Speed in terms of getting the vaccine rollout and here in the United States, but developing economies don't have the same resources and capabilities to fight the pandemic that we do. And so can we afford to let poor economies on their own deal with the situation, and how should developed economies engage and assist with developing nations with these efforts?
Well, I think by the very nature of the question, it's almost answered itself, but let me just reinforce the answer is right. And that is that from a humanitarian standpoint, we should be thinking that this is a priority. Now, granted, there's a lot of other health conditions that are also priorities. You can say, well, why aren't you looking at this and this? But this one is not just a humanitarian issue. This is truly a critical public health issue because, as we just pointed out, if these viruses continue to circulate in the low and middle income countries, we're going to see all these variants are going to come spinning out that very well threaten the integrity of the vaccines we have. So suddenly it is one of the most strategically wise, good economic investments that higher income countries can make is to provide vaccine for the world, make sure everybody has access. And then not only access, but how do we reach out to populations that may be reluctant to take the vaccine? We really need to let the communities themselves best tell all of us how to deal with that. They need to provide the leadership, and I think that that's what's really, really important is that we also understand just telling somebody they must take a vaccine or scolding people into taking a vaccine will never work. That's never worked and it never will. And so what we need to do is work within the communities to understand what are the barriers for them. Why don't you want to get it? What are the things that we can help you understand about them? And I think that's what's going to be really important. And so we have an obligation to the entire world on this one, and the higher income countries are going to have to finance it. And it will be some of the best money they ever spend.
So sticking on the vaccine question, do you have any strategies or recommendations for people regarding how to communicate or try to motivate people in terms of their behavioral instincts to not get vaccinated?
Yeah, this is a challenge. I mean, part of it is if you don't think you have to be vaccinated, you also are likely to think you don't need to take any precautions, going to the bars, et cetera, or go for it. And this has been a major point of where I think opportunities like you present, where the Center for Health and Behavioral Sciences, what a combination. I jokingly, referring to this earlier, as this is the ideal world of chocolate and peanut butter running into each other in the hallway. I've often thought chocolate and peanut butter combined should be a food group. And in this case, here's an example of where, the health and behavioral sciences are key. We need to have the behavioral sciences really in the middle of all of this, helping to understand what are the reasons why people aren't taking the vaccines, what are their knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, and then addressing them literally one by one, not just some monolithic, PSA campaign that says, we care, get your vaccine. Is that going to make a difference? No. And so what we need to understand is, why might one kind of a population say, I'm not interested in it, I won't get it, or versus ones that will. And let me give you a really outstanding example where you can change people's approach. There is a program in Maryland called the Maryland Black Barbers Group that's led by one of the most wonderful senior public health leaders in the country at the University of Maryland School of Public Health. And what they've done is they've empowered Black barbers throughout all of Maryland with educational materials, opportunities for meetings, etc., to let them become a very trusted voice in the Black community in Maryland on a number of health issues, from prostate screening to hypertension, diabetes, all these things, and now in a very big way, COVID-19. And what we're seeing is remarkable changes in the attitudes of what this vaccine might be or not be, and what are the problems with it when peer-to-peer kind of work goes on. And these barbers, who are highly respected, by the way, and they should be, because they are remarkable at what they do, but it was hearing from a barber while you sat in the chair about this, and not somebody in front of a big screen or somebody on a PSA, but somebody you trust, somebody that had the information, and they had the right information. And so I think this is where we have many, many more opportunities to reach out to these different populations. And again, I think your center here is a combination of activities, is exactly that kind of place where we need to bring in that. So just think, every time you're wondering, what can we do about this? There'll be many, many versions or variations on a theme, you might say, of the Black Barbers Group of Maryland. But think of all the different ways you can use that. How do you outreach to so many different people that way? That would be really important.
There's another question, or a couple lines of questions with respect to the pandemic. There was one that was asking about comparing to the 1918, but perhaps phrasing it in a way of, why do you think that this virus went to pandemic levels so quickly? And that, are there things that we can think of or we learned from this to sort of perhaps deal with the next pandemic better?
Yeah, I've spent my whole career largely studying pandemics. I wrote a book in 2017, Deadliest Enemies Are Organs, Killer Germs, that talked all about what the next pandemic was going to look like. And this one, unfortunately, has followed true to that. I think the one challenge I see here, which we weren't prepared for, which really reflects on our experience with influenza, as I told you. Influenza basically, in a sense, went away on its own. It became part of the seasonal flu picture, and surely didn't present any greater challenges than seasonal flu after it went through several waves. With this one, we don't know what it's going to do. I mean, the virus and these variants, that how they've changed, really have made it very difficult to predict. I mean, we just don't know. So I think it's very possible that this could become a seasonal virus, just like we see with influenza, but we don't know at this point. I do know the fact that the vaccines that we have right now may find themselves being less and less effective. It's kind of like that old antibiotic that when it first comes onto the market, it's a gangbuster. It's very effective, but when it gets used and used and used, eventually it loses its firepower because of mutation changes in the bacteria that result in drug resistance. This isn't really vaccine resistance in a sense, and yet it is. If we see these variants being able to bypass the protection from these vaccines, then we're in a whole different world of hurt. And I think that's what we're unclear right now, what's going to happen with that. And if we knew that, that would give us a much better sense of what we need to do going forward. And I just don't see immediate answers at this point.
I guess sort of jumping off of that, we've seen, large increases in anxiety and depression, and sort of declines in terms of behavioral health. What do you think that the long lasting impacts will be in terms of both the young and the old?
Well, I'm not a clinical psychologist, sociologist, and I would dare not go too far there, except for one thing. I started a podcast over a year ago. I was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I had to be brought from, I'm a guy that grew up writing letters in handwritten letters to, I finally emerged into the internet world and got on email. And I had to have some of the younger staff people at CIDRAP, our center there, help them understand how important podcasts were, which I had no clue what they were at the time. And here I'm on Joe Rogan a year ago last March, and it has 15.5 million downloads in just a week. It's remarkable. Okay. So I started a podcast called the Ostrom Update, and which now reaches tens and tens and tens of thousands of people each week. And you know what? The number one thing people are looking for is the science, but only they want the science with all of the personal touch. They want to be able to deal with everything else they're feeling. And we really kind of created a podcast family here. And it's been very interesting because it's not as if only just take care of my heart, but it's if you're going to take care of my head, please also take care of my heart. And I think this has been a really remarkable situation for which we've seen people wanting that. They want to be able to share in that. And so I would say this is going to be an area that I do believe there will be residual for some time to come. I mean, the people who have lost loved ones, the people who have lost their livelihood, their businesses, small businesses that went under, people who literally were isolated for weeks and months trying to avoid getting infected with this virus. These are all going to have residuals. People talk about school closings. We've been dealing a lot with educators. What does it mean for the last year in terms of setbacks, and how much will it be? How resilient will kids be? And so just understanding this and trying to determine what's happened so you can try to figure out how to address it is going to be a huge issue also. And I think that's, again, where academia can play a key role, helping to do some of these studies to understand where are people at? What are that they need? What kind of things basically we might think are going to be tragic implications of this pandemic turn out not to be? But what are the things we're missing? One of the areas I can tell you right now that we're not doing nearly enough is post-traumatic stress syndrome work in healthcare workers. I can't tell you how many people I know in ICUs who are suffering severe levels of post-traumatic stress, just like would be in a war zone. And in fact, I actually had an intensivist, a medical physician, intensive care medicine, had served several tours in the Middle East, Iraq, and ultimately in Afghanistan. He'd seen it all, except for the fact that in his intensive care unit, day after day after day after day after day after day, he had to watch people die, 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 and die. And the other part of that, which was so painful, is they couldn't be with their loved ones. And I happened to catch him on a night where he literally broke down with me on a Zoom call and said, I can't do this anymore. The fourth time today I've had to hold my iPad up to somebody's face so that his family members outside the hospital could watch him or her die. There's an example right there. We've never thought of our healthcare workers in that regard of post-traumatic stress or what they have gone through, and they're not done. So there's another example, I think, of what we can and should be looking at, the kinds of things. How many small business owners lost their business? What can we learn from that? How many people who have had chronic illnesses that have worsened greatly? One of the things we're going to go back and find that in that period last March through June, when much of the country was in a sense shut down, medical care delivery hadn't really planned for that. And so many of the people who would have been screened had they been in clinic and diagnoses found like cancers would have been treated much earlier than they ultimately were, which I think we're going to see an increase in deaths due to certain cancers in this country that were almost totally the result of delayed diagnosis. That's the kind of things we just haven't thought about, but we need to, and that's going to be a critical part of moving forward.
So I think we have time for two quick questions. The
Sure.
first one I think we'll answer relatively quickly, given all of that you've already said. There's a number of students on here and probably faculty that are asking similar questions. To sort of get to the crux of the matter is how soon, once we reach some sort of herd immunity, will we return to some level of normalcy? So there's students asking about wearing masks and so on and so forth. So do you have any ideas on that?
Well, let me just first of all pose the challenge back. I'm not sure we'll ever hit herd immunity. Herd immunity is a concept. Again, remember, we have enough people protected in your population that if I were to be infected and I were around people, I couldn't transmit to them because they were already protected. And so one is we have to understand that we don't know exactly what that number might be that we need to hit herd immunity. Remember, herd immunity doesn't mean transmission stops. It just starts slowing down because the virus doesn't find people receptive to the infection because they're already protected. With B117, we've really started to redefine what we thought probably was a 70 to 75% rate of infection and recovery or vaccination combination. Now with B117, it could be substantially higher. The second thing is herd immunity only occur if we actually get people protected. And so that can occur through vaccine or through natural disease. We're worried that we're not going to see nearly enough people wanting to get vaccinated that would allow us to have herd immunity. That's why, again, I can't repeat more strongly, the message is please get vaccinated for yourself and for everyone else. So if herd immunity were to occur, depending on what strains of the virus are out there, it could be at a very, very high rate. And I'm not sure we'll see that. Now, if we don't hit herd immunity, it doesn't mean we can't have more normalcy. Right now, I believe everyone who is vaccinated should be able to get together and have just one incredible party. Okay, designated drivers if you're driving, but enjoy it. Don't mask, just be together. If you're vaccinated, that's what it's all about. And so that should also be an incentive why people want to get vaccinated because they can feel a much higher level of safety. So that to me is some sense of normalcy right there. But what will be the final understanding of what normalcy is, it will depend on how many people get vaccinated and whether these variants actually end up challenging our vaccine protection.
So for the last question, we have so many students on here that are listening and trying to determine things like career choices. So do you have some advice for students that are either interested in either studying health and behavioral sciences? At Bryant, we're very strong in trying to develop leaders who will be change agents for the globe. And so what do you have in terms of words of wisdom or thoughts for career development and how they can sort of participate, given that they're going to be the next sort of workforce for us?
Well, first of all, be prepared to expect the unexpected. That's important. Have also a sense of creative imagination about what can happen. As we see this global community we live in today, you look at whether it's a coronavirus pandemic, an influenza pandemic, antibiotic resistance, new viruses that emerge that may not cause big pandemics, but are going to be a challenge. A good example, we've started a major program at our Center for Chronic Wasting Disease. Say, what's that? Chronic wasting disease is a prion-related disease transmitted in cervix, deer primarily. And in this country, there are many, 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 many thousands of deer each year that are consumed as primary sources of meat in many families that now have this prion in it. And if any of you remember, and I know there are very few old enough to remember it here, in terms of what happened in England back in the 1980s with bovine spongiform encephalopathy or mad cow disease, where this very serious brain disease occurred from eating this meat contaminated with prions. And it caused basically a very severe Alzheimer's-like picture where people typically, even at very young ages, died within months of actually becoming infected and showing symptoms. Now, that I think is going to happen again in the United States. We are just not handling this thing. We're not testing the deer, and it's going to be a major issue when it occurs. Now, you all can't just prepare your career to go into chronic wasting, but I just give this as an example of the kinds of things that are going to happen. International health is going to become more and more of an issue, not only with antibiotic resistance, as I talked about. Do you know how many of the mosquitoes we're seeing today that are resistant to the basic treatments we have to reduce mosquito transmission? And so there are many, many areas. I think at this point, I would just tell you, immerse yourself in just understanding all the different possibilities. There's lots of job opportunities in government, in the NGOs, and in service organizations like that, and infectious diseases. And frankly, the issues are only going to get more complex, not less. And so we need many more well-trained people. And the only thing I would say, remember the chocolate and peanut butter. Don't give up one for the other. Go with both. Basically understand a liberal arts kind of mindset. I love your minor program. I think it is just the best. And that's going to serve you well. As I've said before, I didn't know on many days in my career whether I was using my biology degree or my political science degree. And it didn't matter as long as I had them both there. And I think that that's what you're looking for and looking at.
Great, thank you. On behalf of the Center for Health and Behavioral Sciences, the Honors Program, and the broader Bryant community, we thank you, Dr. Osterholm, for your talk. It was both informative and intriguing and thoughtful. So we thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to speak with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. And if we can ever help any of you, let us know, okay?
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks.